The goal of this short talk is to give an idea of how a New Testament methodology of missions has been applied in the context and history of the Lord's work here in Ecuador. So using the methods and the patterns of how the apostles in the New Testament performed missions work has given us a method, a pattern of how we want to develop the work. Now, studying this pattern and methodology of missions in the New Testament, we can see that the entire process of missions divides itself into three recognizable stages. Now, the first step is what I want to call or refer to as Missions 1.0. This is evangelism. Building relationships, moving from felt needs to real needs. The New Testament example here is Paul in Acts 13, 15, and 18, traveling to a given new location, seeking out some common ground or common person from which to springboard towards preaching the gospel to others as well. Now, it's important to understand that Paul's normal process of missions was based on first creating a relationship or finding a commonality in a practical, real-life way. After this relationship was established, Paul then would have the right to move towards presenting the real need of that person, which was repentance and salvation. This was intentional, methodical, and in some cases, very time-consuming. Through this gained, acquired relationship, through this common bond, or this felt need, earn the opportunity to present that individual or that community with their real need, even if they don't even have an understanding of what that real need is at the time. The idea in the end is this: relationships lead to evangelism. As we apply this in Ecuador, and specifically in the jungle, when we go into a new area, we intentionally have the goal of building a relationship from which we can springboard into sharing the gospel. Be invited into a jungle village, and in many cases the community's felt need was education. So working with this felt need, initially we build a relationship, a connection that gives us the opportunity or the right to share the gospel with them. And when the gospel is shared as culturally relevant and as after gaining the right to share it, there is usually a mixed response. Those who accept form then a small group, and this small group takes us into what we consider Missions 2.0. So Missions 2.0 is the process of biblically organizing the group of believers into a local assembly or church. Discipline and sharing of life are the goals. So once a group of individuals has come to Christ, after a time of a biblical structure, as we see outlined in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and in Titus 1, needs to be set up. Paul, after initially visiting and evangelizing in a city, upon his return to those cities, we see clearly in Acts chapter 14 that he would set up elders in every local assembly. This is the essence of 2.0. As the growth happens, as maturity continues to progress, leaders and more structure need to be implemented at the individual assembly level so that every assembly continues on to grow disciplined in the biblical pattern, directly responsible to Christ himself as its head, respecting the cultural reality but never compromising on the biblical standard. An example here is the village of Machen. There's one gentleman who lives there. His name is Alberto. He's a mature believer. He's seen in the entire community as an outstanding person, as a light for Christ. He's perceived in the community as a wise leader, but he is polygamous. We need to respect the community order and structure while we never compromise on the biblical standard. So what do? First, it's very clear he can never be an elder. That is laid out clearly in both Timothy and Titus. But he is a mature believer. He is in fellowship. He is an asset. He is a reference point for others believers in holy living and in integrity. So he becomes then a helper for the established elders, a counselor in some cases, a person who understands he cannot be an elder but still has much to give in support of the elders and the local assembly. So to this point, as we contemplate missions 1.0 and 2.0, as we see in the book of Acts, there have been many people who have come to Christ. And now after 2.0, we should have a working, disciplined, organized group that is established under elders in every local assembly. So this takes us then to missions 3.0, and that is encouragement and course correction. As we look once again to the New Testament, we can find that this process is just as much a part of missions as evangelism and as of setting up biblical leadership. Paul was constantly occupied and engaged with the people and the needs of the believers where he had ministered in the past. This was not something that went away as the churches matured, but he continued to be aware and to be involved with them till the day he died. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, after Paul gives his long list of things that he had suffered physically for the preaching of the gospel, he caps off the list with the emotional, spiritual difficulty and weight that he carried by saying this in verse 28 and 29. Apart from such external things, there is the daily pressure on me of concern for all the churches. Who is weak without my being weak? Who is led into sin without my intense concern? So it's clear, Paul continued to be engaged, aware, and involved with the believers, the assemblies, the churches, well after they had been established, well after he had left them. And his interaction with them can be broken down into two categories: encouragement and course correction. Another clear example of this is Paul's interaction with the believers at Ephesus. Paul, in his second missionary journey, visited Ephesus, established a small group of believers there. Later in this same missionary journey, he stayed in Ephesus for almost 3.5 years. But we can see in 1 Timothy, after about 5 or 6 years later, Paul sends Timothy back to Ephesus. Why is that? Why would he send Timothy back to Ephesus to establish elders after Paul had already been there for such an extended period of time? And the answer is course correction. Sometime in the process between when Paul was there and when Timothy needed to go back, there needed to be course correction. So how is this played out on the field here in Ecuador? We try to place strategic people living in strategic villages for extended periods of time to encourage and to course correct the already established churches, assemblies of believers in these communities. Now this is a big investment of people and of resources, but it is necessary so that 3.0, the continuation of missions, can function at its best. So in summary, we have missions 1.0. That's evangelism, building relationships, taking people from felt need to real need. Missions 2.0, the establishing of biblical structure in the groups of believers for the sake of growth and discipline. And missions 3.0, encouragement and course correction, continuing to be involved as necessary for the betterment of the local body of believers.